So one of the things that we have been looking at over the last several days is how leadership communication happens. And the Biden administration has chosen in many instances to either redefine or redirect or just simply ignore what's going on and talk to the American people rather than with the American people who have questions about what's going on. Again, whether that's about Chinese spy balloons or high inflation numbers or toxic train derailments in Ohio. The White House is managing its messages in a really interesting way that has a lot of people on both sides of the aisle wondering who's in the room where it happens and how are those decisions being made. Recently, Pete Buttigieg spoke at a National Association of Counties conference, but remained silent about the Ohio train derailment.
But it couldn't be a more exciting time for transportation. It's had its challenges.
Right.
I mean, if you look at what the American transportation systems have faced in the last 2 or 3 years, partly because of the pandemic, we've faced issues from container shipping to airline cancellations. Mm-hmm. Now we got balloons.
That's right.
But also the best time ever to be working.
So a stunning omission of what clearly was the most important issue of the day. And so this idea of communicating by not communicating is just an interesting strategy. It's not one that I have followed or deployed either in business or in politics or in government. It just doesn't seem to work well in the end. Now, President Biden also spoke at the National Association of Counties Legislative Conference yesterday. He touted the America Rescue Plan, the CHIPS Act, and the bills around infrastructure. No mention of Chinese spy balloon, even though Secretary Buttigieg had mentioned the spy balloon earlier.
But if we're going to have the strongest economy in the world, we have to have the strongest and best infrastructure in the world. That's why I asked Congress to pass the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment Act, larger than any investment made in infrastructure since Eisenhower's interstate highway system. A number of Republicans came together with Democrats to help us get it passed. And we're rebuilding the country through the bipartisan infrastructure law.
So it's really interesting how the administration has chosen to do this. And again, I want you to set your politics aside and just look at it from a communication strategy standpoint. I am a firm, passionate believer that any president of any political party can talk to the American people about anything. It's how they do it and when they do it and why they do it that actually makes the difference in the end. Now, I spoke yesterday to Jeff Cox, and Jeff Cox is CNBC's economics editor. He always helps us break down the numbers of what's going on. And so, of course, we got new numbers out and looking at inflation. And he said that the Fed has now created a new measure for defining inflation. It's called supercore inflation.
The Fed's really starting to parse this stuff down, though. We have this new component as if we needed something else, another metric to throw in there. We have this so-called super core now inflation, which is core inflation, which excludes food and energy. Now we're also excluding shelter from that the Fed is looking at. That was up about 0.2% last month, and it's up 4% year over year, which is still a little too high for the Fed's comfort.
So you've all heard me say this many, many times, that words have meaning and the meaning matters. And if we continue to drain the meaning out of meaningful words and principles, we end up with a lot of nothing that just doesn't fly with the American people. So here we have inflation. I have yet to speak to an American citizen who has not been concerned, complained about, whined about, be worried about how inflation is impacting them, whether it's the price of eggs or the price of gasoline or affordability of housing. Everyone's being hit by all of those and a host of other things, by the way.
Derek Overstreet here from the New Millennium Group. Listen, what I'm hearing a lot of is that folks would love to have an income plan that is specially made just for them. that provides an income stream that they cannot outlive as long as they're living. If you'd like a copy of one, give me a call at 888-999-6370. That's 888-999-6370 or utahsfinancialplanner.com. We're standing by right now.
And so it used to be that you had this core index, which took out what the Fed declared were the more volatile things of energy and food. But now those numbers are still very high, and the American people are feeling it. And so what has the administration, what has the Fed done? They've created a new category, the super, because it's always better if it's a super, right? Super core inflation. And super core inflation takes out of the equation the price of housing, the price of energy, and the price of food. Like, what's left? Like, of course, inflation would be zero if you take all the components out of it. And that's where the messaging and the communication problem begins. And it begins because if President Biden stands up and says, look, the super core inflation rate is really low, and the American people are going to say, what are you talking about? Because I can't afford to buy eggs, and I can't fill up my gas tank, and my kids are having a hard time getting into a house or even just getting a rental. And so when we drain the meaning out of the words, that's not communication. That's manipulation. And I don't know anyone who loves a leader who manipulates the words to match the moment to their benefit. And so then you end up with an authenticity and credibility crisis in leadership. And I think that's the real challenge. I think it's a challenge for the administration. I think it's challenges for both political parties and leaders up and down the scale from government to business to community and beyond. Because in our internet 24/7 news cycle, that's what we've started to do, is to just reframe, redefine, or just ignore the things we don't want to talk about. I think it takes a real leader, an authentic leader, to have an authentic, honest, real conversation with the people they're leading. But if all we get is hype and spin, or all we get is manipulation, or we get talked down to, or we get told that it's complicated. Remember, especially in Washington, complexity is dangerous. Simplicity is really powerful, especially when it comes to communication. Now, yesterday, I thought this was interesting. At the White House press briefing yesterday, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked specifically about President Biden's ability to communicate crucial things in the moment. Here's the response. Okay, so if the president is the best communicator they have in the White House, he is the president. I actually think Dr. Jill Biden might debate him on who the best communicator is in the White House. But again, it was sort of a sidestep and a dodge, and I actually thought the question was pretty good. I think they were asking, look, every president has a strength. Some are really good off the cuff. Some are incredibly good off of a teleprompter. Some are really good in a back and forth with the press. Some need to have a little more formal sit down. And that's okay. The American people are fine with all of that. You just have to be upfront, authentic, clear, talking with, not at, the American people. And so to me, that's the real leadership test of communication. And then you're up in the middle trying to figure out what's happening over in Israel. Give us the lay of the land. Where are we?
So the lay of the land is that the government is seeking to, my language, to eviscerate the judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court. In an effort to do so, they are enacting literally hour by hour, day by day, obviously, laws that will minimize the reach of the court, will change the manner in which justices are appointed, change the relationship between the Supreme Court and the legislature, the Knesset, and it is clearly this is thought through by the government. I mean, this is not something that's being – it's not impetuous. It's not spur of the moment. This is something that clearly has been in the works. It is for those of us who believe in the rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances. Our language in Hebrew is this really is undermining democracy, and it is a battle. yesterday and Monday there were, again, depends on the numbers, a couple 100,000 people demonstrating outside the parliament. There are rallies every Saturday night. Today, being Tuesday, the heads of the major banks met with the finance minister, telling him that the rate with which money is leaving Israel is 10 times faster than any previous recorded tracking of money. Significant investors, people with billions, are withdrawing their entrepreneurial investment money from Israel. President Biden on Monday issued a 63-word warning to Prime Minister Netanyahu with respect to the settlements. Secretary of State Blinken has been very clear about it. But in the complicated Israeli politics, Prime Minister Netanyahu is beholden to his extremist factions. What's important for him, Netanyahu, who is under trial, literally as we're speaking, there are witnesses every day, his trial is ongoing, is to have his trial suspended. I think that would be the right word in English. The world is, those of us, not only people like me who track this, not only Israelis, but when he was in France, when Netanyahu was in France last week, Macron was pretty clear about his criticism. I don't know yet about other European voices. As I say, Biden has been very clear. What's going to be the reaction of, call it, the moderate American Jewish community? Unclear. But in terms of the question in Israel as we speak, there is, from the government's perspective, a very clear step-by-step plan to eviscerate the power of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and so let's dig into a couple of those things that you raised there, Amos. Starting with the Supreme Court, my understanding is one of the significant pieces of this transformation that is being attempted anyway is that the Knesset would actually have the ability to overrule the Supreme Court of the land.
So there are 3 or 4 important issues on the table. Again, what I'm telling you is correct here. Where are we? 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? One is to change the way in which judges are appointed. There's a judicial appointment committee at the moment, which is comprised of sitting members of the court, members of the Israeli bar, the justice minister, and a couple of representatives from the government. That is going to be reversed or changed, tweaked, and it will be the majority of the people on the committee will be members of the government. So in terms of separation of powers and checks and balances, it eviscerates it totally. If I, as a justice, to be appointed, need to curry favor with the government, there is no checks and balances, separation of powers. Here in the United States, the President of the United States nominates, but the Senate confirms. That won't happen in Israel. The government will appoint. That's one. 2, there's something called override. So at the moment, the Supreme Court has sitting, it's a unique Israeli mechanism based on British law. It's the Supreme Court sitting as a High Court of Justice, which reviews petitions filed against the government. So at the moment, there's an override which says the court can override legislation passed by the Knesset, the parliament, if it violates basic laws. Remember, we don't have a constitution.
Right.
I believe on Wednesday or Thursday, the first reading of the override bill will be heard before the Judiciary Committee, eviscerating the court's right to override Knesset legislation. And the only exception to that will be, it's impossible, that the overriding can only occur if it's an 11-0 unanimous holding by a court. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
And not only does it have to be 11-0, but the justices have to agree that the legislation passed by the Knesset so egregiously violates a basic law. Go find egregious, right?
Right.
So it creates a mechanism by which the Supreme Court cannot review the legislature. Again, separation of powers, checks and balances. The third thing that is going to happen on Wednesday, 2 weeks ago, the court ruled that the Minister of Health, Aryeh Deri, who's been convicted twice, sat in jail, I think, for 7 or 8 years. The court ruled that he cannot serve as a minister, and what Netanyahu did is absolutely ignored the court. And tomorrow there will be a law introduced. It's called a personal bill, in which the government will vote to override the Supreme Court.
All right. Next thing I want to get into, obviously checks and balances are a big deal in this country and on this show. So those are all things we're going to watch really closely. One of the things I want to get to and give us some perspective on this, help our listeners understand You talked about this coalition. We're so used to just having a two-party system. The Knesset, I don't know how many are in there, but he had to cobble together a really wide swath.
He did. So
explain that to us.
So it's a parliamentary system. There are 120 members of the Knesset. To have a government, you need to have 61. So the Likud, which is the largest party, which is Netanyahu's party, has either 32 or 34. So I'm not good at math. But 61 minus 32 means he needs, let's say, another 30. So where did he find the other 30 from? There are two Orthodox parties. One is an Ashkenazi party, which is Jews from Europe, and the other Orthodox party are Jews from the Middle East, North Africa, called Sephardic Jews. So those are Orthodox parties. The only thing that interests them is money, serious money for their schools, because they have a separate school system.
Right.
And then there's a new party. It's been around a little bit, but it's primarily new and powerful. And that's our very extreme right-wing party, headed up by a guy named Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is in many ways, pains me to say this, he's the kingmaker. My terms, he's a racist, he's a fascist, and he's homophobic. Other than that, he's fine. He never served a day in the Israeli military because the army didn't want him, because he's been convicted who knows how many times on violence and incitement. Irony of ironies, he is the minister, well, we in America would call him Minister of Police. We call him Minister of National Homeland Security. And he did extremely well in the November election because he was able to galvanize young voters. How did he do that? First of all, he's extremely articulate. He's a demagogue, is frankly what he is. We had riots 2 years ago. The first time ever we had riots between Jews and Arabs in Israeli streets. He used that to his electoral advantage. So back to your questions, you have to cobble together a coalition. He needed 61 plus. I think it's 64. That's right. It's exactly 64. And unless something dramatic happens, he can hold on to that 64. But there are two buts. But one is there's in Israel something called the Norwegian law. Why Norwegian? Because it came from Norway.
That's a good name for it.
Good name for it. That the head of the party, Netanyahu, can force an individual who's a member of parliament and a minister to step down from being a member of the parliament, and he brings in someone else who did poorly in the primaries and then is beholden to Netanyahu, and that person can't vote. Interesting. So, but at the moment there are 7 members of the cabinet and also of the parliament who are potentially maybe soft under what's called the soft belly. Who potentially will come to their senses and flip. We'll see. There's a public call to them. Earlier today, 70 rabbis said this is crazy. Yesterday on TV, one of Israel's most important commentators called them out one by one. The protesters, the demonstrators are incredibly creative, unbelievably well organized. And every day, or I think it's twice a week maybe, demonstrators are literally protesting outside the homes of these particular 7 in the effort, I think, to frankly embarrass them.
Wow. Just a few things happening.
That's why you get up at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Why you get up at 2 o'clock in the morning. All right, so give us one thing to watch in the coming days. What's one thing that we ought to be looking for that is either going to say, yep, all of this is just going to continue to storm roll through and Bibi Netanyahu has the momentum and the control and that stays, or things that might be sort of that tipping point and maybe that soft underbelly that might fracture the coalition and change direction? Netanyahu
in previous days was sensitive to economics and to economic power. And the fact that, so 3 things are happening economically. 1, major investors are just not investing. 2, there's a call for people not to use credit cards anymore. This is it's highly organized. To go to a cash-only economy, because that hurts the banks. They want to come to the government and need help. So economics, I think, would be helpful. Biden yesterday did the 63-word statement. If Biden really, I think he's going to have 2 options here. It's a fork in the road. 1, to make it very clear to Netanyahu, you will not be invited to the White House. We are, I don't know if I would say freeze Israeli-American relations. We're going to minimize, I think would be the right word. I think that would be impactful. And 3, if the demonstrations became so loud, and we'll see what's going to happen in the next few days, that it becomes for those 7, those are the critical, those 7, if there's a mechanism to